Okay, thanks, Sean. Thanks to the whole kind of big name collective for getting this whole event together. The venue is just awesome. Food is awesome. Everything's great so far. Community Day was really cool. So give them a big thank you if you see them in the hall or whatever. Anyway, today I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot of different topics. So just to kind of give you some background, because a lot of people aren't familiar with this, but Laravel is on a 6-month release cycle. So Laravel 4.2 came out in May, basically coinciding with the Laracon in New York City. And so that means that Laravel 4.3 will come out in November. And that basically mirrors the Symfony release schedule, because Laravel does use about 10 or 11 Symfony components at this point. So it's very convenient for us to kind of be on the same release cycle as Symfony. So usually when they tag their stuff as stable, then usually just a few days later is when Laravel releases. And they don't have like an exact day that they do that during the month. So it's hard to give an exact day beyond saying like late November. So that's when 4.3 will come out, and I've already done a lot of tinkering with 4.3 and a lot of experimenting. A lot of it has been informed by people in the community and different ideas and discussions with people inside the community and outside the community to kind of get to kind of simplify and streamline the framework a little bit. But before I get to that, I've got a little checklist up here with me to make sure I cover everything. Homestead and Forge, I'm not going to talk about them very much in this talk, but just to give an update, Homestead does ship with PHP 5.6 as of like 4 a.m. this morning. So if you have Homestead and you use Homestead to do your Vagrant thing, if you go to your Homestead directory and just do Vagrant box update, that will download the new box, which includes PHP 5.6. And you can start playing with that, since it just came out yesterday or the day before. On a related note, Forge does also do 5.6 now. So if you make any servers on Forge today, they will be PHP 5.6. And I'll be pushing out probably some kind of recipe or some kind of thing to upgrade if you have a 5.5 server, to go ahead and upgrade that to 5.6, because it's a pretty straightforward deal. So that's kind of a brief update on Homestead and Forge. Anyway, Laravel as a framework. This is a base 4.2 app right here on the screen. Is this a pretty good size? Looking at this folder structure, we've had basically 3 directories at the top level: app, bootstrap, and public. And public is, of course, your front controller and your assets and stuff. Bootstrap is kind of more of a system thing, where we actually require the composer vendor autoload, and we set up a few configuration paths and some environment detection and stuff like that. You really don't come in here very often, but mainly you're living in this app directory, which has a whole heap of directories inside of it. It has commands, which are like your artisan commands, config, controllers, all the stuff you're used to. And this is a very kind of Rails-inspired folder structure, mainly in the sense of controllers and models and having views in here and all that stuff. It has a very kind of Sinatra-inspired routes file, and then it also has a flat file for defining filters, which are kind of a type of middleware. So like for authentication, like you can see here, if this person's not logged in, they get redirected, blah, blah, blah. We also have this funky start directory, which does a bunch of random junk. It registers stuff in the class loader, and the reason we even have this is because to make it convenient for you, since this is not a PSR0 structure, and it's definitely not a PSR4 structure, when you make a new controller, to keep you from having to do composer dump autoload, since it's a class map on that directory, we have this like fallback class loader that will load that controller for you. So it's kind of a hacky solution, honestly, to keep you from having to run composer dump autoload all the time in a class map situation. It also sets up like logging, error handlers, the maintenance page, and requires your filters. For a long time, a lot of people in the community have been kind of moving away from this type of folder structure. And even in my book that I wrote last year, I expressed my disdain for the models directory, or even just the word models had become kind of vague of all meaning post Rails. And that we needed to kind of find a better default solution for structuring your apps. Because one of the most common questions I hear all the time is, where do I put X or where do I put Y in my Laravel app? Because this is a very, it's not a very robust folder structure for building even just a simple, even just a non-trivial app of any kind is going to quickly outgrow this folder structure. So, where do we go from here? First, I want to preface by saying what I'm about to show you is going to be really scary to a lot of you if you have a Laravel 4.2 app. But I want to calm you by saying that there is a mechanism in Laravel 4.3 to run this folder structure on Laravel 4.3 so that you can upgrade to 4.3 without having to mess with your folder structure. It only takes like 10 or 15 minutes to upgrade. I tested it on a Laravel 4.2 app to make sure that the upgrade was very easy. And then if later on, if you want to kind of restructure your app directory, you can do that at a later point. It's up to you. Or if you have your own app structure you already like, you can just stick with that. Okay, so let's take a look at a new structure I've been playing with. And this is, I guess you could say tentative. I wouldn't say it's set in stone, but I think it's definitely in the ballpark of what 4.3 could look like. Okay, so here's the top directory of Laravel, 4.3. You can see that a few folders that were in app have been moved out here to the root. So like config and test and storage and database have all been moved out to the root. And in a sense, I like to think of definitely config and even your migrations to an extent as, you know, obviously kind of configuration options, even the migration files. Bootstrap is essentially the same, and then resources contains your views and your link files. And storage essentially contains the same stuff it always did. But what's interesting is this app directory. This looks very different from Laravel 4.2. And let's just kind of go through it from the top down. So console is basically your console commands, and it ships with a little dummy kind of hello world command as to kind of show you how to set up a console command. It just gives you a nice little inspiring quote to stir your creative juices. HTTP contains your controllers, your filters, and your requests. Now, let me go back to my 4.2 project. Remember this filters file? Like say I want to find some random filter that I've defined in here from my IDE or Sublime Text. There's no easy way to do that besides just going to filters and scrolling like this until you see it or finding it or something like that. It's not a very good way to develop, and if you have a lot of filters, this file will get very bloated, and it's just generally kind of janky as a whole. So in 4.3, we've organized that into classes. They correspond to every filter in 4.2, so it basically looks the exact same. The auth filter makes sure they're logged in. The CSRF filter checks the request token on the request. Controllers look exactly like they did. They're just organized in a little bit different spot. So you've got your basic home controller. Requests I'm gonna get to a little later. And then you've got your typical routes file, which hasn't changed at all. So that's the HTTP folder. And then if you remember that start folder I mentioned that had the start global file that tends to get really bloated and a lot of random junk gets thrown in there. That's now been organized under providers. So instead of like cramming error logging and bootstrapping into those start files, we now just have like a log service provider that you can use to configure your logging for your application. So the start files have been better organized into these providers, which kind of always have served as bootstrapping for the core of Laravel, but I don't feel like have really been embraced for people who are developing their applications on top of Laravel. And then the user model is the typical eloquent user model that you're familiar with. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of what the app directory looks like. And this directory is namespaced under PSR4, so you'll notice that this is namespace app. And if I go to HTTP controllers, this is namespace app HTTP controllers. And so what's really nice about that is you never have to do the composer dump autoload every time you add a new file. So this is always going to be autoloaded for you. So what you would do if you started a new Laravel 4.3 app is in my terminal, I probably don't want to use the namespace app for my app. I want to name it the name of the app I'm building. So let's say I'm building Forge, for example. I would come in here and say PHP artisan app name and then just Forge. You can see that it's updated this entire directory. So all the filters have been updated to the Forge namespace. If I look at my composer.json file, it's even updated that so that it's now namespacing app to the Forge namespace. And basically everything is ready to go. My whole app has been renamespaced. So it's really easy. If you did like a Laravel new blog to start a new project, you would just immediately do PHP artisan app name to renamespace that whole app directory. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me just clear out those changes because we don't really want to bother with that right now. Okay, so we're back to app. Let's see, moving on. App name. Okay, so generators. In Laravel 4.2, we had like a controller generator and a migration generator. In 4.3, we also have a filter generator, so I can say, all the filters are now organized under the make namespace. Let me dump autoload. So it used to be that you said controller make or like migrate make, but now they're all under make, so they're all under one namespace and easier to find. So I can just say PHP artisan make filter foo filter. That's going to create it. It's going to respect the namespace that you have set. So I reverted it back to app, so it's going to use that. But it's going to respect whatever namespace is currently being used in the app. And it's injecting the request, and basically you just fill out your filter, and you're ready to go. Now, how you would kind of hook into this filter is in your filter service provider. You can just come down to your filter array and give it a name, and just list the class that is associated with. And then you can attach it to a route just like normal with the before key in your array, in your route array. You still with me? Okay, so this filter service provider is just like kind of a helper. I can list my before filters, which the maintenance filter is what checks if your app is down or up using the PHP artisan down and up commands. And then you can hook in a global after filter if you want, and then your key list of just route filters that you can optionally hook into. So it's just a convenient, kind of a convenient provider for registering those filters. Okay. There's also a generator for providers. So if you're in a more service provider based type of mindset, instead of adding stuff to your start file, if you want to do something new, like bind some new type of service into the container, what you would do is just do PHP artisan make provider, and then we'll just call it foo provider. But let's just call it events provider, which would be something more real. Okay, so that's going to give us basically a blank service provider. And in register a boot, we can do whatever we want. We could register an event listener with the event dispatcher. We could register something in the IOC container. And then all we need to do is just add that to our list of service providers in our app config. So it's very easy to generate these basic pieces of the framework that you need, like filters, providers, controllers are still generated the same way for resources and so on. Does that make sense? Now, with one caveat to namespacing controllers is, let's go into our routes file and say we want to generate like a URL action, or you can just use the action helper to like foo controller at some method. Since your controllers are namespaced, this gets kind of inconvenient because you would have to do like app HTTP controllers, which is getting pretty verbose. But what the route service provider actually does for you is it registers a root controller namespace with the URL generator, so that when you build an action link, all you need to really specify is everything that comes after that root controller namespace. So I still only have to say foo controller at some method, and the URL generator will know I really mean app HTTP controllers foo controller. So if I just dump that out for instance, for home controller, this is dangerous. Home controller index not found. Anyway, but you would just leave off that part of the namespace. I don't know why that's not working. Anyway, so that makes it more convenient, so you don't have to always specify that full namespace all throughout your code. Okay. And okay, so that's kind of wraps up my checklist on the structure of things. I'll wait till the end to take questions, because I'm sure there will be kind of a lot of questions about this, because it is pretty different. But kind of the goal here is to get you into a better structure out of the box, so that when you start a new Laravel app, you're not immediately having to kind of restructure everything for your project. So this setup is designed to be robust enough to handle basically a larger size project as well as smaller projects, without having to rearrange everything and kind of be boxed in by the old folder structure. Okay, so that's a preview of the new directory structure in 4.3. And going on, I want to talk about some new kind of general features. First thing I want to talk about is the Ioc container. And this is kind of going to build up to a big new feature in Laravel 4.3. But let's go ahead and just make a new container instance that we can play with. This is in the Illuminate container project. And if you've never used a container, kind of how it works is, like, say we have a class called something, and then we want to just generate an instance of it. We can just say container make something. You don't have to actually configure the container if it's a concrete type, so that if I hit that route, you can see that we get an instance of something. And this works recursively too, so that, say we have a something else class, and something depends on this. Let's just dump out that. You can see that that got injected as well. So it works all the way down your object graph. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the container, but there's a new feature in Laravel 4.3 which lets you do something like this. This container call method accepts a callable, and it will call the closure or the callable that you pass in, as well as pass in any dependencies that it's type pending. And so when we run this, it should call this anonymous function and inject in an instance of something. Someone called it before I saw it. All right. Okay, so it called that anonymous function and passed in something. Okay, that's cool and okay by itself, but we can use that to power a lot of really interesting things. So previously, let me go back to a controller. Let's just simplify this back out. Okay, so I'm going to leave this class something in here just so we can kind of keep playing with this for a minute. If I go into my home controller, previously on controllers, you could do something like this. Your constructor could type hint some dependency, and that would get injected in. So that if I hit this route, I need to dump autoload or something. Oh, the namespace. So that if you type hint something on your controller constructor, it would automatically get injected in. However, now you can also do something like this. in addition to that. You can type in something on a method. And that gets injected in. And so this works for more complex routes too. Let's make this like home ID, like if you're passing in a route parameter. I can still keep that dependency and just put ID second. And it doesn't even matter, I could put it first. It will figure out the order. So if I hit, what was that route? Home, like 1, you can see the 1 got passed in. Or if we just dump out func get args, it's an awesome function name. You can see we got something and then the route parameter. If I reverse those, you can see it still works. It still comes in the right order. So it's going to read that out. It works with model bindings and everything. Okay, so that's the next step of building on that container call. We can use that for even cooler stuff. Back to this HTTP request thing. And at this point, I think I need to switch branches because I've already got some stuff coded out, so we don't have to watch all of it. Okay, let me switch to this Laracon branch. Going back to the HTTP request folder. Let's go ahead and generate a request, and we'll just kind of walk through it as we go. Let me dump auto load because I can't remember if I did that. PHP artisan make request. First, let me preface this by saying I have a little view. When I switch to this branch, I have a little create user view, which has a form. And it just has name, email, and it dumps out any errors that are in the little error message bag. Okay, so it's just a simple create form, nothing real fancy. Okay, and let's go ahead and generate a controller. We're going to do a user controller, and I'm going to use this new plain tag, which doesn't put any methods in it. And then I'm going to say, I don't know, show create form, and I'll just return that view. And then we're going to have a, let's just call this create, to do the actual creating of the user. Okay, so we'll fill that in later. And then we'll actually go ahead and fill up our route. We'll just do route get user is user controller show create form. And then let's go ahead and put the post route user as user controller create. And I actually want to name that we're going to give it a name as user store. Okay. Thanks. Live coding. Okay, so we've got those two routes. We've got our view. It's a blade view. User controller show create form returns that view. So let's see if I can hit it. Okay, there's the little create user form. Now, like Kirk talked about validation, there's a lot of different ways to do validation. So let me show you an interesting way I've come up with. It would be cool if the request could not even make it this far if it was invalid. So that would save us a lot of boilerplate code. Let's go ahead and generate a create user request. Okay. This extends something called form request, which in turn extends the Symfony request. So this is a true request object. You can see it has two methods, rules and authorize. Let's look at the rules. For creating a user, we had two fields, name and email. So name is going to be required. Let's say that it has a max of 255, and that's probably all we want for name. And then email is also required, and it needs to match the email validation that PHP has built in filter var. For authorize, we're just going to return true because we want to let any user make this request. And that's really all there is to it so far. So now what we want to do is, this is an app HTTP request. So back in my user controller, I'm just going to use that class. And I'm actually going to type pin it right here. We'll just dump it out if we make it this far. Okay? With me so far? Okay, so this validated without us doing much of anything. We just type pinned it. If I fill in this name field, you can see that passed, but email is still required. What's actually happening here is when the Ioc container resolves this, there's a hook into the container that Laravel adds that says, is this a type of form request? And if it is, I need to validate it before I inject it in. If the validation fails, it's going to throw some kind of redirect exception and go back to your view, flash the errors. It's intelligent enough to know that if it's an AJAX request, you want JSON errors back. If you want to customize that, you can override a response method. Return anything you want from there, any kind of error formatting you want. Say this returns false. I'll give you a good example of that in a second. But say these are all filled out. This got forbidden since we returned false. What you would do here is, like, to give an example from Laravel Forge, if you're trying to like update the IP address of a server, you would make sure that the user that's trying to do that action can actually owns that server. So you just return a Boolean like the user ID on the server record equals the ID of the logged in user. So it's a simple, fast way to do authorization and basic validation. Now let's go ahead and pass validation so we can see what we've got here. Okay, so if I pass in Taylor and my email address, you can see we made it into the controller now. So this create user request, it is like I said, it is a full Symfony request. So we can actually just get all the input like we would, kind of like you would from a facade, but you don't really need the facade anymore since this is almost better. If I make this request and I dump out that input, you can see I've got the full input array. So at this point, you can do whatever you want to it. You can pass various input into your service layer, domain layer, or you can map it to a command, to your command bus, whatever you want to do. But the request cannot even get into your controller without being valid. So it's really handy and nice and saves you a lot of boilerplate code in terms of redirecting and flashing errors and all that. Is that pretty cool? Okay, so that's kind of the gist of form requests that is in Laravel 4.3, and I've already got a few things that need to be tweaked on it, but that's the main idea of how it works, and I think it's really cool. I think it's cool. One, it's really cool to be able to inject things into these controllers, so even if it's not a form request, you can just inject the regular request if you want, like if it's a Git or whatever you want, a repository, however you want to do things. It's just really nice to be able to inject things into those methods sometimes. Okay, so that is form request. I'm going to keep moving here so I can stay on time. Okay, total change of topic. We're done with form request and validation. Let's go back to our routes file. Okay, I'm just going to comment these out. Let's see, where do I start with this? Okay. Let's make a service, an infrastructure service that talks to a queue. We're going to call it foo service. You have a constructor maybe, and it's going to, well, you have options. If you don't have a constructor, maybe you're using the queue facade straight from this service. Okay, there's a few issues with that you might want to consider. One, you're kind of hiding the dependencies of that service, and two, you're kind of tightly coupling yourself to the implementation Laravel is using. So what some people would do is inject like an Illuminate queue instance. So something like Illuminate queue, I don't know, queue manager or something like that. And that's probably a little better architecture than using the facade, but at the same time, you're still really bound to Laravel's Q implementation. And if you're trying to build like a really pure domain layer, you really would want to avoid that. You really want to code against like an interface or something. Which brings me to an entirely new repository of Laravel code called Illuminate Contracts. Illuminate Contracts are interfaces that cover all the main parts of Laravel. So there is a Q interface that defines a few basic methods: push, push raw, later, and pop. Okay? And any Q system can implement this interface. This Illuminate Contracts is nothing but interfaces. There's no implementation anywhere in this whole repository. It has no dependencies or anything like that. It's strictly a very light interface package. All the main components in Laravel 4.3 implement some of these interfaces. So the authentication thing implements an authenticator interface. The cache implements a cache interface. The benefit that gives you are multiple, but I'll go through them one at a time. Now you can just type hint to that contract. Okay, and if we, I'm just going to do this quick and dirty and resolve it out of the container this way. If we resolve this foo service out of the container, we should get an implementation of that Q contract, because these are bound to the Laravel implementations by default, but you could always rebind them. Okay, so if I hit that default route, you can see that actually injected the sync Q implementation. So now you've totally kind of decoupled that service from being bound to a Laravel implementation, and if you need to customize or re-implement that queue, you just implement that simple for-method interface and rebind it in the container to point this contract to your implementation. Does that make sense? It feels a little murky when I say it. Yeah, so another benefit of this, say you're building a package, and your package you want to tap into queue functionality, or you want to tap into mail functionality. Instead of pulling in the whole Laravel mail package, which also pulls in like views and maybe even a few other things, just use Illuminate Contracts, which has a mailer interface that you can use. You don't need to pull in the whole Laravel mail component. Just pull in that simple interface. In an ideal world, these would all be PSR interfaces, but that would literally take to like the heat death of the universe to get all those interfaces defined in PSR. Where there are PSR interfaces, like with logging, we just stick with the PSR interfaces. Where there's not, we define our own and Illuminate Contracts in a very light package. So yeah, like I mentioned, if you have like a mail dependency you want to have, just inject in a mailer implementation of that contract. And we got the Laravel mail implementation. So already by doing this in Laravel, like we've reduced dependencies from a lot of different packages, because we don't need to depend on the full implementation from Laravel. We can just depend on contracts. Do you see the benefit of that, or do you have any questions on that so far? Okay. If you don't want to, you don't ever have to think about this, but I think as you're getting more into like better designs are more part of the conversation in our community, I think you're going to find this very appealing as you're building your services and your domain layer to give you a really nice, they almost have a one-to-one match with the current facades, but let you get into a much more flexible architecture with basically not that much of a big mental leap from what you were doing before. And it's very easy, like if you want to find some functionality you need to just come out to the repository, to the code, and just say, oh, I need an event dispatcher. Okay, it's just Illuminate Contracts Events Dispatcher. It's very easy to find the functionality you need to type hint. Okay, so that's the Illuminate Contracts thing. Kind of a deeper topic, but I think going to be very valuable down the road. Okay, now there is a real interesting contract called File System. Laravel had a file system class, or it still does have the same Illuminate file system class, which is kind of very specifically tied to local disk file systems. But if we have a file system interface, it would be cool if we had like multiple implementations of file systems. There is a package that does that. I think you've heard of before. If we type hint that, let's see what we get. Okay. We're going to get this file system decorator. And it happens to be decorating Mr. Frank de Jong's file system package. There is a new configuration file called file systems, in which I have my default driver for file system set up to local. I also have a cloud driver set up to S3, and then I can configure as many, quote, disks as I want. So there's my local driver. This is kind of like your database connection file. Here's my S3, which I've got my key and secret in the environment already, and then say I have a rack space configuration. Now, of course, the default is local, so when I type hinted this file system, that's what I'm going to get. If I wanted like a file system factory, I could type in it like that, and then I could say like files disk S3, and then get to any type of disk I wanted to. But as long as I just type hint the file system, I'm going to get the default driver, so to speak, or default disk. So let's go ahead and play with this for a second. Let's get rid of this. We don't really need that anymore. Let's resolve out a file system. Illuminate, contracts, file system, file system. Okay, and then it has the very similar interface to what you're used to, basically the exact same interface that you're used to for working with files. File put, we can just say file.text, my file contents. And the way file system works at a local level is you give it a root directory. That's configurable in the config file. By default, I have it set up to the storage working directory. So when I write file.text, it's actually going to be relative to that directory. So it should show up in that work directory. Okay, and once we do that, let's just go ahead and well, we'll just let it fall through. If we hit that, we should see it make the file. Okay, so there's file.text, my file content. So that's very straightforward, like you would expect. Okay, now let's say I want to use S3. You say a lot of apps have both local and S3. So what you can do, there's actually two interfaces. You could type hint this for your local, and then if I want to go to the cloud, I just type hint the cloud contract, which basically extends that local contract. Now if I hit this files put here, this is dangerous living right here. It's going to take a second. It hit. Okay, so now I should be able to just get that right back out of S3, basically without changing any code. I got to actually show you. Second time's a charm here. All right, so we pulled it from S3, just like that, just by changing that contract. Now, what you could do is in your file system configuration file, you could actually set your default to be S3 as well as your cloud. And that way, just file system in general would always give you S3 without having to worry about the cloud implementation. Having the two different interfaces is really nice because I know at work with Snappy, we store some files locally, but a lot of files we put in an S3. So being able to type hint either the cloud versus just the typical file system is really nice. And you can configure as many different disks and S3 buckets and whatever as you want. So this gives you like a super slick file system abstraction, thanks to Frank. And we just kind of put a little sugar on top of it and make it really easy to use for you. You think that would be useful? Okay, change topics. Okay, that's file system and contracts and all that. And don't worry if this is all like kind of blowing you against the wall. Don't worry, because Jeffrey's already recorded probably like 150 Laracasts that go up tomorrow. And I know literally they're already recorded on a lot of these features, and I know he's planning to push them up on Friday. I guess that's tomorrow. And so you'll be able to watch those and kind of recap all this information as much as you want. And as far as I know, those are going to be free videos. Okay, change of topic. With kind of Laravel 4.1 4.2, we came out with some optional Laravel components. One of those was Laravel Envoy, which is like an SSH task runner. One of those is Laravel Cashier, which abstracts Stripe recurring billing. And with Laravel 4.3, we are bringing out another optional component called Laravel Socialite, which lets you easily authenticate with Facebook and GitHub and Twitter and Google. That's the fourth one. It's literally couldn't be any easier to use. Let me go ahead and make a social controller, and we'll take a look at what it looks like. Even I'm getting caught by this. Okay. Social controller. Let's make a login method. And we're going to have a callback method. If you're not familiar with OAuth, how it works is in the login, you would redirect to the OAuth provider that you're connecting to, and then they would actually call back to your app, passing secret tokens and handshakes and stuff. So what we're going to do is use the Socialite package to authenticate with GitHub. There's a couple ways to do this. We could inject, Socialite has its own contracts, its own interfaces that we could inject a Socialite kind of factory, make a GitHub provider, and then redirect. Since I've been doing contracts, I'm just going to show you the facade way in the controller. I'll just use that Socialite alias, and all we're going to do is say Socialite, or it's actually Socialize, I'm sorry. Socialize with GitHub redirect. When they call back, we're just going to socialize with GitHub and get the user. The user is going to be a standardized user object across all OAuth providers, so it lets you depend on common properties like username, user email, user nickname, so that you don't really have to worry about the differences between the different providers and what they return. When we get back, we'll just dump that out so I can show you kind of what that looks like. Okay, I don't really see any obvious errors here. Let me make a route for it. Route get social login. Social controller is going to go to login. Then we're going to make a second route for callback. Okay, this is probably the most dangerous part of this. When we hit social login, we should get redirected to GitHub. Okay, authorize. We should come back and get my user. Boom, okay. There we go. That's all it takes to authenticate with GitHub. This is kind of that default thing I showed you. I guess this token is only valid for like this application, so don't try to screenshot it or anything. But it gives you, the ID, the nickname, the email, the avatar, URL. So if I take this and just paste it into my browser, you should get a nice avatar. And it also kind of embeds like the raw payload from GitHub, so that if you do need to get into like everything they give you, that you can access that however you want. And the way you'd work with that is probably you would just take that user token it gives you and save it to your database, and then you can use that to make API requests. But literally authenticating with other providers is just as simple as doing like Facebook here or any other provider. And what it's actually doing is in your config services, you would just make an array for that provider with your client ID, your client secret, and your redirect URL. That's really all you need to set up. And you just would do that for the providers you wanted to support. Okay, so that, again, that's an optional package that's not baked into Laravel core, since that's not really a core concern, but it is something useful that you can pull in and quickly get OAuth authentication running. The OAuth 1 authentication, I do want to credit Ben Corlett, because it is powered by his OAuth 1 package to authenticate with Twitter, which is the only OAuth 1 provider that we're currently working with here. Okay, so that's Laravel Socialite. That will be it's out on GitHub, but it's targeting 4.3, and it's just an optional thing you can pull in and use if you want, kind of like Cashier. Okay, one more thing before we go to questions. Let me get rid of all these routes. Who here has, who has a lot of routes they register in an application? Let's say like 200. or so. Quite a few. Forge has 140, I think. Snappy probably has quite a bit. Who has, how many do you have? You can just say it. Did someone say 800? Is that serious? Okay, so we'll use 800. We'll use 800 as an example. I mean, that's not bad. I'm just like, it's just a big application. Okay, so 800. Can anyone top 800? Okay, I've got a little code snippet here that I want to pull in because I don't want to make you watch me type this part. Let me just copy this in and I'll explain it. Okay, let me close some of this junk out. Right here, I'm going to change this to 800 so we can make 800 routes. Oh, this doesn't break. What I'm going to do is actually generate 800 random URIs to simulate the 800 routes of your application, and then I'm going to bind them all as routes. We're going to bind them all to the same controller. That won't affect the performance at all. That's going to be the same. And then we're just going to see how long it takes to bind 800 routes in an application. Does that make sense? I'm just going to dump out how many milliseconds does it take to register 800 routes. This is on every request to your application, so 632 milliseconds. I don't know, in web years and web time, that's years. That's like a long time. Okay, what would be cool is if we could avoid having to do all 800 of those routes on every request. And we can. In Laravel 4.3, there's a new route cache command. So what I want to do is run, well, first I want to stop it from dying and dumping out the milliseconds. Then I want to run PHP artisan route cache. Okay, route cache successful. Then I'm going to take this millisecond thing. Let me copy them both. And I'm going to go into storage, meta, into this little route cache file. And we're going to see how long it takes for the route cache to load 800 routes. What was it, 632 seconds? 630? So that cut out a lot of milliseconds off your app. If you have a more typical app, let's say like, for example, Forge I mentioned is like 150 routes. That still takes probably like 160 milliseconds to register. With the route cache, that would only be like 2 or 3 milliseconds to register 150 routes. So it is very much a great improvement to the performance of your application, not having to call route get 800 times. If we can just basically go wham and throw all those routes in all at once, then it's going to make things a lot faster for you. One caveat to this is this will not cache closure-based routes, so you need to be using controllers to take advantage of this, which people with 800 routes probably are using controllers. They probably don't have 800 closures. But just something to keep in mind that if you do want to take advantage of this and you have a few closure routes, you might want to move those into a controller so that you can take advantage of this, because it'll be a huge speed boost to your application. Okay, so that's route cache, and that's pretty much all the cool stuff I have to show here. So we can take a few questions maybe if there's time.
Firstly, thank you very much. That is really awesome and very exciting. I just have one, I have a stack of questions, but I don't want to be a douchebag about it. So one particular question in respect to the root control namespace. Currently with our one of our products, we have a number of packages that serve controllers and all sorts of things from these various packages. Yeah. Can the root control namespace deal with that at all, or we still need to refer to the full qualified namespace?
That's why I made that configurable, so that if you're in that situation, then you might just want to use the full namespace because you're depending on a lot of packages that use controllers. It can deal with that, but until the package updates it, so like if you want to do a full one, you just basically like a PHP namespace, you just lead it with a slash, and you can do namespace controller whatever. You know what I mean? And that would always use the full thing and not prepend any kind of root namespace. But if you're depending on a lot of packages that do that kind of thing, you might want to just disable that thing until you're sure that your packages are kind of respecting that, and then you can turn it on if you want. But that's why I made that specifically configurable.
About the route cache, if you have routes defined in service providers of external packages,
Yep.
will they be cached as well?
Yeah, they'll be cached.
So you run all the boot methods and then
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, they would all be cached.
I was just wondering, or here.
Oh, sorry.
I know originally you were sort of against namespacing the controllers. What sort of kind of pushed you to namespace them?
I wish PHP namespace importing didn't totally suck. I wish you could import a whole namespace, but I don't know. I can't whine about that forever, you know? Like, eventually I'm going to have to just accept the fact that we're not going to have that. So it just made sense to go with PSR4 because it's what people are doing. It's the way things are heading. And I don't think it will be too much trouble, but yeah.
I know you added like the view helper method.
Yeah.
Is there helper methods for all the other facade stuff too?
No,
like
there's not things for, mainly like some things you would use in the controller, like the view factory thing made sense to just make a helper. You can also like redirect off a helper because that's a pretty common controller activity. But there's not helpers for like every type of thing you would do, no.
Cool, thanks.
But also injecting things into being able to inject the request into the controller relieves you of a lot of having to use like request facade or input facade because you have the request injected in for you. So you don't really need to mess with that anymore.
Awesome, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, you told us at the start that you don't like the model folder.
Yeah.
And so, but where do I put them now? And if I have collections and models, where?
You could just make, like, say you have an entities folder or something like that. You would just put it right there in app. Did that not make anything? I guess not. There it goes. You can just put them all in app. The app folder now is your app code. Everything, all the configuration and stuff has been moved out basically. And this app serves as the real meat of your application, so to speak. So you could just organize this however you wanted. You could have an entities folder, a services folder, a repositories or database folder, or access folder, whatever you wanted. So it's kind of up to you how you want to build your app on top of this. So yeah, basically it would all go in the app directory though, any kind of real code. Does that make sense?
Just define the routes in the composer file or in the start file?
There's still your routes file like you would always have. It's just in the HTTP directory with the controllers and requests.
No, the path to the entity folder, which
it's
doesn't know.
It's configured for you in Composer, so like it's PSR4 to that app directory, so that if you made like say an entities thing, you would just namespace it with your app, entities, and then the class, and it would be loaded for you. But of course, like I said, don't feel like you have to have your namespace be app. You would use the app name command to renamespace it. What?
Yeah. You moved views into the resources folder. Can you perhaps shed some more light why you did that?
When I said this was still tentative, I kind of had that in mind because I feel like we're still kind of discussing that. It didn't make total sense to be like in your app folder with all your real code because it's more like HTML and presentation stuff. And the same with the language is kind of presentation type stuff. So we kind of looked a little bit at Symfony, and I know they have a resources directory and stuff, but I feel like that out of all this, that directory is the one I'm still like thinking about the most and thinking like, does that make sense? And I'm still open to feedback on that since we have a couple months before this ships out. So yeah, if people have better ideas or other ideas on where to put that, I would be open to hearing them.
No, I actually think it makes total sense because how I view views, they're more like data consumers. They're not really part of your application logic. So
Yeah, the app, I mean, even app, I'm kind of viewing console and HTTP as console and HTTP is kind of APIs into your into your real app entities and services and stuff. And yeah, and then it just doesn't make sense to me to have views with all that other, meaty code.
What does it look like to handle a failed authorize request? As in that GitHub didn't authenticate, it returns back an error or whatever.
Are you talking about with the social thing?
Yeah, sorry, socialize, not authorize.
Gosh, I can't remember. It basically doesn't it package you back like an error reason or something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I'll get with me later and I'll go through it. I can't remember exactly how you handle it. But.
No more questions? Okay.
Cool. Anyways, like I said, don't be scared about the folder structure. If you have a 4.2 app, you can use your structure and just it will still work. You just plug in. It's called a legacy structure service provider. Everything will still work the exact same. That's totally serious. It will bootstrap everything so that it works just like 4.2. And then if you feel like moving your folder structure to something like this, that's fine. If you don't, you can keep on trucking with how things work. Doesn't matter. It still only takes about 10 minutes to upgrade to 4.3. Okay.
Okay, sorry. So this whole kind of point of a legacy system, obviously it's being deprecated in some way or another. So it actually raises an important question: is how are you going about the process and method of actually deprecating kind of older systems on Laravel, in particular, for example, that structure?
Well, the thing with the structure is Laravel has almost never cared what the structure was, because we have in the bootstrap directory we have these paths which can define where things live, and there's even more now in 4.3. But you could always kind of rearrange the structure, and the core didn't really care. But yeah, since so much did change going to this, I felt like it would be a disservice to the community not to have a way to upgrade without rearranging all your folders, which seriously would be a pain in the neck. So I'm presuming, we've had this structure for several years. I'm presuming that we'll have this new structure for several years, and we'll just kind of evaluate it then. Maybe if it ever does change, we kind of do the same thing. We ship a kind of a shim to make the fallback structure work, and when people want to move, they can, or if they never do, whatever. So I don't know. But I did want to make this upgrade I didn't want to, this is not a huge, this isn't like Laravel 5.0, so I can't just make you change everything. So having a fallback or a provider that lets you upgrade without messing with this was, a necessity pretty much.
Taylor over here. I see that you're using Sublime Text. And I was just curious, is that how you normally work? Will you work in Sublime Text?
Typically this is how I work. Yeah, I have tried PHP Storm, and when I look at PHP Storm and I see other people use PHP Storm, I swear they have different software than I have, because when I see Jeffrey or Sean use PHP Storm, it's like this magic voodoo stuff flying everywhere. It looks super productive, but I need to get like a one-on-one lesson or like a PHP Storm mentor. Laracon has courses on it. I have no excuse now. Yeah, and special thanks to Frank and Ben too for making so many of these cool features possible, really. And we're just kind of standing on their shoulders with some of this stuff. So. My package is part of the league as well. So. Yeah, PHP League, and Frank's is too. Yeah. Yeah, so thanks to those guys for, and Laravel's kind of always trying to embrace packages and cool and in ways that help you build apps more efficiently and more quickly and just better. So.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Taylor.
Thanks.